My timepiece says it's 2 o'clock.
I'm with you.
If I could have everybody's attention, I believe it's 2 p.m., a little thereafter. So let's call the meeting to order. First, I would ask Representative Nix if he would open us up with a word of prayer.
Go ahead to number 27.
Yes, sir.
Let's pray. Lord, thank you for allowing us to come today and the great position of service to the people of Georgia. Just pray that you would guide our thoughts as we hear the bill today and as we consider the legislation that's before us, that we would do the things that would be pleasing to you. Lord, we just thank you for everything that you do, and we pray that you would bless all that's said and done. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Preacher. Before we get started, I do want to recognize a special guest. Former Governor Barnes is here with us, and I believe is going to speak, so it's an honor to have you in the committee. Thank you for being here, Governor. Yeah. A couple little housekeeping before we get started on the today's hearing on House Bill 82. Representative Kendrick's House Bill 75, I'm going to appoint a subcommittee to hear the bill, to have a hearing on the bill. Chairing the committee will be Vice Chairman Williamson here. I'm also asking Representative Caldwell, Representative Dickey, Representative Duncan, Representative Flood, Representative Frazier, Representative Jordan, Representative Strickland, and Representative Teasley to serve on the subcommittee to hear House Bill 75. Also, I'll go ahead and make mention, Representative Ramsey has House Bill 344. We will have a hearing on House Bill 344 sometime next week. So you can go ahead and put that on your calendar, and we'll find out exactly when that is when we get a room schedule. Okay, there's Chairman Earhart. Again, committee members, this is a hearing only on House Bill 82, Chairman Earhart's bill. Chairman, you can proceed whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask my counsel to also questions that I may not be able to. And this is Mr. Fred Bentley.
As you wish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity for hearing on House Bill 82. I've enjoyed serving on this Banks Committee for probably 16 to 18 years. We've heard a lot of interesting pieces of legislation in here. I guess I can apologize up front for the Cobb County Mafia. I have certainly Mr. Bentley's an attorney in Cobb County who I've known and worked with for many years, and Governor Barnes and I, although populating different parties, have worked together since I was a kid. He was running his hardware store and practicing law before I got out of school, but he and I have had a long and good friendship. Back when I was the minority whip and he was the governor of Georgia. He was always cordial and professional with me, and we've got a long history in that. So I think this is a bipartisan concern. Members of the committee, House Bill 82. You all remember I was involved in the hearings of the Senate bill last year with respect to these successor creditor issues. And just to state right up front, I don't know that there's one solution to this. I do know there's a problem. Yeah, you heard the testimony. You may hear some today, probably not as emotional as some of the testimony that we heard last year on, I believe, it's Senate Bill 441. But the situation that I particularly believe the FDIC has put us, an arm of the United States government in a sense. I think the chairman himself mentioned, they're picking winners and losers. They're They're insinuating themselves into the system. They're creating corporations to do business. They're changing the whole dynamic of the financial industry in an artificial way. They're forcing the banks in Georgia to participate in business practices they would have no interest in doing otherwise. It wouldn't be a sound business practice to go out and prosecute these loans the way that these foreign or outside successor creditors do. It's cutting off your nose to spite your face. So what the angst I had with the bill last year was it truly did insinuate itself in between the contract that an individual signed, which I find is a sacrosanct piece of paper. You sign something, you need to live up to that. Well, what I've attempted to craft is something different in House Bill 82, and let me walk through what I think House Bill 82 does, and then I can talk to you a little bit more about where I think it's different, because this does not insinuate itself inside the contract. One of the things that we do in the financial services regulation of the state has always done is they control the interest rates. We have a usury statute in the state of Georgia. We allow the tax redemption sales, and we cap the interest rates on that. That's something that's not inside the contract. That is something that we do have the oversight on as legislative members. And sometimes we also get into the time frame of these types of things. Again, this is not saying that you can't collect on a debt or anything like that. So let me tell you what 82 does. It's a very simple piece of legislation. It's designed to level the playing field for guarantors against these successor creditors. TARP took care of the large banks, and loan loss arrangements protected banks. You can argue that one way or the other, but no one protected the guarantor that relied on the bank to honor their commitment. Their commitments to fund. House Bill 82 provides a 10% return to a successor creditor within 30 days, and it provides a 20% return to a successor creditor within 31 to 90 days. That's your time period, and that's the two basic interests. That's patterned pretty much right after the tax sale redemptions, the FIFAs that are out there. So this is nothing new. This is not an outrageous. Thereafter, the successor creditor, after this 90-day period, they can pursue the full amount against both the guarantor and the borrower. Again, we're trying to set up a situation where the local businesses, the people in your community, the banks, again, they're told, the FDIC tells them, you're going to dump this set of loans. And then, by the way, these companies that are doing this, they're out there. They're not from here. They're all, and that's not necessarily all bad, but they don't have any connections to your community, and they're going to pursue these without reference to what the actual facts on the ground in your community really are. I think the banks would probably like to have these people back if they could be given the opportunity to work out these loans in your community. These people would experience success again. They were the job creators. They were the people who were putting money in the economy previously, and once they get back on their feet, they'll be creating jobs, producing capital again. But you let one of these successor creditors beat them into the ground because they have no connection, then hey, they probably won't be back. The bill doesn't affect the collection efforts on any debts or judgment held by an FDIC-assured financial institution. It only affects these successor creditors. Once the banks push these off and they're sold in the secondary market, they're off their balance sheet. It's not yours anymore as a banker. That is gone. It only allows the guarantor limited relief if paid within 90 days. It's, again, no effect on the ability to eventually pursue this borrower. The substitute that you have in front of you, I wanted to go a little bit further and make it even clearer that it addresses how the notice is provided and recovery of not only the 10%, the 20%, and the eventual everything, but the due diligence and the closing cost expended by the successor creditor could be collected. I'm trying to make this as clear that nobody is out. They're going to get these dollars. The substitute also addresses the failure to comply by these successor creditors by limiting recovery to the amount paid plus the cost of the due diligence. and the closing cost. And finally, it doesn't affect any debt or judgment sold in excess of 60% of the distress value, and it encourages payment of greater value for packages of notes and judgments. You're going to probably hear a lot of things on a lot of different sides of this. I'm going to leave it with the idea that one of the arguments you consistently hear is that this is going to chill the market for the secondary loans. Ladies and gentlemen, these companies were put in business by the FDIC. I'd love to get put in business by the government for 80 to 90% of my overhead and capital. I guess I've never been in the right place at the right time. They're going to keep buying these loans. That's all they do. As long as there's bad loans out there, they're going to be in business. They don't have any other place to go. And again, it's not affecting the banks. There's no chill on this market. That is a specious argument in the extreme. So, and let's hope that there's a day when there's not a market for these, and the banks can work these loans out inside our communities. And people need to pay what they owed, but they don't need to pay. Why do we have a usury law if you can come in here and collect 200, 300% interest or whatever? We cap that because we have a responsibility to some best practices with respect to fair debt collection. Mr. Chairman, that's my presentation of House Bill 82. I'll pause now and take any questions, and I'll defer any that I can't answer. I may ask my counsel to help me with.
So your counsel's just waiting for questions. He's not going to speak to the bill. Okay.
That's correct.
All right, you have a couple. We'll go ahead and we'll take, I believe, representative from Augusta.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I have just a simple question with respect to the language in House Bill 82. I know oftentimes the legal verbiage is something that most lay people just don't quite understand.
That's why I got him.
Us policy wonks do, but most lay people don't. Could you give us an example of a successor creditor so that we can have a face or picture of what a successor creditor is, and an example of what a guarantor is?
Okay. A guarantor is any person who agrees to pay, in whole or in part. That's what a guarantor is. You come in and you guarantee a loan on the original debt or the obligation of another person, basically. That's the layman's term of what a guarantor is. I mean, you come in, your child, in the simplest form, you're going to guarantee that your son or daughter possibly is going to pay their debt, and you sign your name on that as well. That makes you a guarantor of that debt. Does that make sense? Or you can be a guarantor individually. You're guaranteeing that you are a person who has the capacity to repay a debt. That's a guarantor. Does that make sense? No. Okay. A successor creditor. These are those who, try to put it in terms that I understand as well. I mean, to me, as I've been in the banking industry as well, but the successor creditor is generally a company, a corporation that purchases the debt that a bank had. A lot of these debts are classified as in levels of how bad they are, how long you haven't paid it, in a sense. And once it gets to a point, the FDIC tells the bank, okay, you're going to sell all of those debts over here to these companies. There's several that do this. I'm trying to make this not about companies in here, but there are companies that do this. They're successor creditor companies. In other words, they become the person that they sold your note to. They own the paper of that used to be the bank's. You went in and you made a deal with your bank that you were going to borrow $1,000, you're going to pay it back on such and such terms, and for whatever reason you couldn't pay it back, it gets to be so bad, or at whatever point, then the FDIC tells the bank, well, you're going to sell all of those notes off, and these successor creditor companies are going to come in, and they're going to beat on you till they get it. And in your contract, it says that they're allowed to do that. And I'm not saying I'm going to get in between that contract. All I'm saying is that when they get that opportunity to come in there and get after you for that note that you didn't have, that at least you're going to get one more bite out of the apple for 30 and 90 days. And if they can only get basically what anybody else in the state, like a FIFA, to sell a tax lien, and that's basically a usurious interest level, So we're going to, inside that first 90 days, it's going to be 10% and then 20%. And then after that, they can get the full value.
Would homeowners be able to basically do the same thing?
Would
Would homeowners be covered under this?
No, this is not the home mortgages. That's correct.
Unless it was a specific guarantee.
I'm sorry, unless it was a specific guarantee. I'm sorry, but more than likely, these generally are not. These are not home mortgages.
Representative Coomer, I believe, is next.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, for presenting this bill. I want to make sure I understand exactly what the bill would do, because I have heard a lot of discussion about the bill, and in reading through the bill, I'm not entirely sure. In fact, that last response makes me believe I may have a complete misunderstanding of the bill. So let me set it up.
Do that.
Well, what I mean is, I thought this bill would apply to the situation where you have a home buyer who defaults, and you've got a creditor who comes in and buys the distressed property at a foreclosure sale, and then essentially this would allow that borrower to come back and pay for the distressed property at a substantially reduced price. But are you saying that's not what the bill does?
I'm going to defer here if you don't mind, because he can probably give a better example of this from the legal side of the equation to my counsel.
Yeah, where there's primary liability, this does not affect the borrower's responsibility. It does affect, Mr. Chairman, the situation if there is a guarantor outside of that borrower. For instance, where we use the description of the father coming in and signing for the son as a co-signer before they pursue the guarantor. So this gives that guarantor the opportunity, if it's sold outside the traditional markets, if it stays within the banking market, if it's sold to another bank or assigned to another bank that's protected by the FDIC in terms of guarantees, they can continue to collect against guarantors, against the original borrower. It does not affect the ability to go against the borrower, however. So if it got to that point and you were signed as a guarantor and it went to the third market, then in that one instance, you are correct. It could be pursued that way.
So when you're talking about guarantors, I know you used the example of a family member. Would that also apply to like the for example, like a VA loan? Would the VA be the guarantor in that scenario?
No, sir.
Okay. I'm just kind of having, and I don't mean to be too dull about this, but I'm just having a hard time wrapping my brain around exactly who we're addressing, or who. I understand there's been some push from a policy standpoint to try to help home buyers who have been caught up in a distressed mortgage market. So if that's not who we're trying to help, I'd like to know really who we're trying to get at here. I mean, where are we really going with this bill?
I think you're going to see some examples of some of the people that will testify that can give you more of an objective of the types of collection activity that has happened. Do you remember some of the testimony on the Senate bill last year?
I wasn't on this committee last year.
Okay. You heard from a lot of those who develop subdivisions, those who develop profitable shopping centers, those types of things. These are the people, again, who are providing a lot of the engine that the community banks in the state. As you know, we're down to very few community banks. It's just there's not as many as there used to be, and now it'd be nice if we could continue to have a market for those types of loans.
Okay. So this is, I think the bill you're referring to from last year, because I wasn't in this committee, but I think I recall there being a substantial push for awareness on that bill, maybe toward the end of the session, and some people describe that as a bill of developers versus bankers, and I think, not saying that was a fair description, but I think, is that the bill you were referring to?
That's the bill I was referring to last year, and again, the angst that I had, and many of us had, was that bill truly insinuated ourselves inside the contractual obligation that guarantor and borrower had from the beginning. I submit that this particular legislation does not. I am trying to come at the same problem from a different angle to try to, like I said, I consider there is a problem with the way the FDIC is pressuring and putting our financial services industry in this state and other states into a situation where it's not your traditional borrower and bank. They're bringing in the quasi-governmental FDIC into the equation, which is never good. And then you've got these successor creditors that are being brought into the equation, and that's where I'm going. You heard a lot of testimony last year. The Home Builders Association was very much a part of the testimony for that legislation last year. It wasn't just developers. It was home builders. It was developers. It was the General Contractors Association. All of those who benefit from a great deal of this market that's out there, whether it's homes or offices or condominiums or whatever it is that's being built. They are affected by the successor creditor market.
Now, up until about, may I continue?
Let me just say, judging by the way this is lit up, I can kind of see where this is going. One more. Save your best question for first, and then we'll come back around. We've got a couple hours, and if it's what it takes. It's an important bill. We don't want to cut off.
Answer as many questions as I can.
Yeah, of course, I know you are. So save your best question for your first one, and then we'll come back around. Go ahead and proceed with
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What you were saying.
I got a lot of good questions, so I'm going to have to narrow it down, though. Actually, so I can just clarify this point we started on. Up until about 2008, I did almost exclusively did real estate litigation. So represented builders and contractors and home buyers and all of them who had money to fight with each other. I got to represent some of those folks. Now, they all ran out of money, and so I represent them in divorces. But that's a different issue. But that's the good thing about small-town general practice. You can do that. But a lot of those folks that I represented in 07, 08, in many situations, there were developers, builders, contractors who had a company. They had Johnny's Houses LLC that was a primary on a contract on a loan. But they were the co-signer in that case would be Johnny, the actual builder. So, in your bill, would this allow Johnny Smith individual to buy Johnny Home Builder LLC's bad defaulted loan at essentially 60% or at some very significantly reduced rate by stepping in as the guarantor of really his own flow-through company?
Yes, I mean you could buy it. I mean I would take it somewhat of an issue, a significantly reduced rate. I mean 10% in 30 days, 20%, and these are loans that are being sold at 10 cents on a dollar at auction. So it's a significant market for whoever's getting this. And then after that 90-day period, you can still get whatever. It's kind of maybe we can if you're doing divorces, well, this is kind of like a custody battle. Who's got custody of this note, and what can they do once they have that custody?
Okay.
Thank you. It's good questions. Is that you down there, Chairman Houston?
It is.
Okay.
I just had a question. If you went to borrow money, I mean, when you co-sign the note, you guarantee that you will pay in case the first person on the note defaults. Okay. Would you have to change your contract? Is there any way at the bank?
Not at all for this. That was my major point. That I don't want anybody to be let out of paying a just debt. All this does is it says how much of an interest rate can be charged once you pay it, and it says and it changes the time. That's really all the differential is. You're still the guarantor on the note. That hasn't changed, and the bank can pursue it. The bank can pursue it, and the successor creditor can pursue it, but they can only pursue it at an interest rate that is under the Georgia usury rates and in a certain time frame. It's giving these folks just a little bit more time to pay it off. I'm not changing their contract. They have to pay. That's what. Can I let him answer that as well?
Madam Chairman, I think the way this works is it's within the breast of the bank. In that instance, the bank,
We're talking microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Everybody's
Excuse me.
straining. Yeah, yeah.
If it's-
I've never borrowed money any place but except a bank.
yes, ma'am. So if it's there with an FDIC-insured institution, if it's been sold, it doesn't affect it whatsoever.
Okay. that's
And
what
you
I
can
thought.
pursue it till the, as they say,
So
till the
it doesn't have
cows come home.
anything to do with our bonds.
That's correct. It's only if it's sold on the secondary market for a non-FDIC protected or insured institution.
I'm just trying to understand.
In that instance, they're buying it at a special rate. They're getting the benefit of that, and it gives you that chance to redeem it if you're the guarantor only. Not the original borrower, but the guarantor.
Only the guarantor.
Only the guarantor, and they pay the premium plus any cost incurred by that institution
Well,
to
why
acquire.
did the guarantor just step up and pay the loan off?
They didn't have the money.
All right, okay.
Well, and I think if you look at it, there were a lot of banking institutions that set up loans and had obligations to loan money. They got in trouble, and the regulator said to them, "You're not going to loan any more money." So they reeled in the obligations to continue to loan money. Well, if I've built a model to sell homes or to do something, all of a sudden that right is taken away for me, and I was depending on that money to come in, then it allows some leveling of the playing field. I mean, when TARP money came in, if you'll think about it, many of the large banks dumped assets into the market. And when they dumped the assets into the market, rather than loaning money to shore up the market, then what happened is we ended up with your home probably being devalued. I know my home was devalued substantially. And so many folks lost lots of money on their investment. Well, if I was depending on a market maintaining a certain level of liquidity, then this allows somebody a chance to get back on their feet when they've actually put money or put their livelihood into something. So, and it just keeps an outside entity from coming in, buying it for cheap, and then trying to pursue a much larger amount.
It was the FDIC that changed the rules, not our good local banks.
Let's do this, because I can tell, of course, when we did our sign-up sheet, we didn't put a for or against because we're not necessarily voting. But I tell you what, let's do.
Whatever you want, Mr. Chairman.
Governor, why don't you join these gentlemen here?
Sit on the side so he can.
Yeah, and then once we kind of go through this process, and we'll continue with the questions, and then we'll move for some folks I feel I can just about be reasonably sure to have some questions or some concerns that they want to mention. So 17's up next, but I'm going to let Governor Barnes go ahead and yeah. Governor, why don't you go ahead and make your remarks, and then we'll Representative Flood will be next on the list.
All right. Let me have a few remarks, if I could, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions. I'm like Mr. Krumer over here. I used to do a lot of commercial litigation. Now it does seem like it has turned into more divorces, business divorces or otherwise. Except for Buddy Pullen back there, who has about as much gray hair as I do, I don't think that many have been through all of the recessions we've gone through in my lifetime. 74, 75, 76, 82, 83, 91, 92, and then the Great Recession that started in 2008, which it was like nothing we had ever seen. And what happened in the prior recessions were that you had a washout. I mean, let's face it, real estate is what grows this state. If you want to know why your revenues are down, the revenues are down because real estate is down. That is what made Georgia. It is what continues to grow the tax digest, and real estate crashed. A large part of it, the fault of regulators who said real estate is a bad loan, I don't care what the credit is, and we're going to stop it. And in years past, you had a washout. All right, everybody, Mr. Crew, I'm sure if you've represented developers, you know they get into a tight, they wash out, they go broke, the bank writes off the loan, they get back on their feet, and they start back in business. And some of them have been very successful, and some of the greatest and names that you know in real estate that have grown this state have gone through that cycle in the past. This time, because of the intervention of the TARP, the Troubled Assets Recovery Program that existed, and because there was a policy to save the big banks and really close the small banks. That was the whole policy of the federal government. It impeded the right to wash out that debt. So what did the United States government do? Well, they went out and when they would take a bank over, as Fred, Mr. Bentley said a few minutes ago, they would take, if a bank received TARP, they'd tell them, get rid of the debt. And they'd sell it for 10 cents on the dollar, a nickel on the dollar. I've seen some sell as low as a penny on the dollar, even though it had security now. Remember, these are all loans that's got security. And in your example, Mr. Crow, yes, it would be Johnny. Johnny had 50 lots, and they've still got the 50 lots, but they don't want the 50 lots because FDIC had told them, don't you take those lots back. You sue that fellow. In years past, they took the lots back, they sold them, they reduced the price, it washed out, the recovery came back. The greatest impediment to the recovery in this state, and I suggest to you in the nation, has been the United States government and the FDIC. Now, I'm not telling you that and this is a debate for another day, that banks didn't get speculative and wild in some of their lending, but that was also encouraged by the regulators. This is a business model you ought to follow. All right. I want to emphasize what Chairman Earhart said. This does not affect a bank. If a bank made the loan, and even if that bank went out and is taken over by another bank, this bill does not affect one bit that obligation. That successor bank, even though it's getting 80% of its losses paid in a loss share agreement by you and me, we're paying 80%, of that loss. Sometimes the original, some of the first loss share agreements were 90 and 95%. Even though we're paying that, it's still, and they've paid them for the loan, the bank can still recover, the original bank and the successor bank can recover 100 cents on the dollar and every penny in interest. If they can if they can collect it. Find the money. Now, what this does affect is what I call mostly government-created debt vultures that came in. The government, the FDIC went in and they said, all right, we're going to set up these companies or give assistance to these companies. And by the way, you know who owns most of these companies? Goldman Sachs and places like that. In other words, the ones that got us into this mess are the ones that's getting the benefit on the other side. So Goldman Sachs, Fortress Insurance Company, all of these others that got us into this mess to start with, now the government went to them and says, listen, in some cases, we'll even give you the money at 0%. 0% to buy this debt for 10 cents on the dollar. And then, when it was bought, it triggered what is called the detention doom doctrine and what's called the federal holder in due course. Let me give you what that means. I've got a case I'm defending right now. The borrower was building out a large residential development, was not behind one penny, He goes up to get his draw, and they said, we can't give you the draw. we can't give you the draw. Well, of course, he couldn't pay anymore. And then his note got sold to one of these debt vultures, partially owned by some of the boys on Wall Street. And so when you come back up here and they sue him on the debt, 100 cents on the dollars. I said, wait just a minute. You defaulted. You defaulted on the loan. Well, because the FDIC acquired the paper, you can't raise a claim back against us. Detention Dome says that you cannot raise a claim. You can have some set-offs, but you can't recover damages back against us, even though you're the one that defaulted to start with. And so they put you up, they sue you on the debt. You have no defense because they say we're a federal holder in due course. We're the FDIC. You can't make a claim against us or anybody we lay our hands on and give that immunity to. And so you say, well, why do we need this? You need it for exactly circumstances like that. This bill does not affect one bit a bank or a successor bank. What this says is, if you're a debt vulture, generally set up with some kind of federal assistance, or Wall Street boys that got us in here to start with, that you're limited to 120% interest in the first 30 days. 120%, that's what 10% is, you know. 120% APR. 10% if you pay it within 30 days. That's 120% APR. Pretty dang. You're getting 120% on the money you got invested, you know. And then if you get up to 90 days, over the 30 days, it's 20%. That's 240% interest, APR. You get a 20% return. Now, after that, the full discount price, you can recover the full amount on it. Now, this argument is going to be made, and I've been wanting to answer this for some time. Well, this impairs the sanctity of a contract. You know, even though you're prevented now from raising a defense under your contract, you're prevented from raising a defense under your contract because the government of the United States, the FDIC, took it away from you. And by the way, the failure to they've held that is not a taking of compensation. You don't, I mean, you just get it. It's part of the regulatory process. And so the argument is, well, it takes this breaches the impairment of the obligation of the contract. You're not breaching anything. The original agreement with the original obligor, the original person that was obligated, and the original lender, the original borrower and the original lender, the original guarantor and the original lender, you're not doing anything in that contract. What you're saying is, when you buy the debt, if you're a non-bank, when you buy, a debt vulture buys the debt, when they buy that debt, then your return, your interest rate return, as the chairman has explained, is limited in the first 30 days to 120% a year, in the first 90 days to 240% a year. There is a new contract. The new contract is the purchase of the debt at a discounted amount. Now, some states, Georgia's not one of them, and we're not trying to, another way you could have skinned this cat, and we're not trying to, I told Fred and David and Earl when they came to me about this, I said, because I knew I'd litigated several of these cases, we're not trying to upset the whole apple cart. We're trying to deal with those who have created jobs in the past. And to be quite frank with you, I'd like to do something for homeowners, but this is not the bill that does it. This bill deals with commercial loans that are Johnny or John Whelan or John Williams or anyone else that is a borrower and who has been required to guarantee the debt. What what many states do is they say when you buy a debt at discount, the discount goes into the overall usury rate. In other words, if you buy a $1,000 debt for $400, then that $600 is interest. Georgia's had a long standing, because Georgia is a creditor state and not is a lender state. Its laws are very skewed toward lenders. The General Assembly and the courts have held, pursuant to the enactments of the General Assembly, that discount amounts are not interest. And that's another problem that this hopes to enter. So what you're trying to do is have a rifle shot on the people that were creating jobs and that have created jobs since World War II in this state. Are you going to keep them down so that your state stays down, or are you going to allow them back up so they can start creating jobs again? So that's all this does. What it says is, if a debt vulture has bought your debt, and you've guaranteed it, whether you're Johnny or whether you're whatever, that the folks that bought the debt are entitled to a fair return. They're entitled to, if you can come up with the amount that was paid for the debt plus 10%, which is within the first 30 days, you can buy it. And the fellow that bought it gets a good return. His contract's not been impaired. He bought it. He knew what he was buying at the time. He was buying a $1,000 debt for $10. And he's going to get a return on his $10, a good return. You're not taking anything. You're not impairing anything. And then after the 30 days and up to the 90 days, then you get a 240% return. And then after the 90 days, you can get 10,000% return. I mean, this is nothing but fairness. And what you've got here, you either force these folks. These folks don't want to go into bankruptcy. They don't want to go in bankruptcy. The last thing they want to do is to go in bankruptcy. It's the easiest thing to do. Just throw it all in bankruptcy and it's discharged. So what you're doing is you're penalizing the folks that want to stay out of bankruptcy and get back in business by keep kicking them while they're down, because some folks up on Wall Street decided that they needed to make a 800% return rather than to allow them up and to come on out. So what you're going to do, if you don't do this, is you're going to force them into bankruptcy. More and more of them into bankruptcy. So in summary, let me just tell you this. So what happened here? Well, the big banks got tart, and they got paid out and saved. The big banks got a loss share agreement when they took over the little banks that held this debt. Most of the big banks don't hold this debt. It's all mostly debt that got washed out in takeovers. That's when it comes. That's where these debt vultures come in. It's not when another bank comes in and takes them over. Is they wash it out. So the big bank got taken care of with TARP. The big bank got taken care of because they were guaranteed an 80% minimum loss share. In other words, when a bank is taken over, when you read about local Mableton Bank is taken over by Bank of America or BB&T. BB&T was guaranteed 80%. That 80% of any loss in taking over the Mableton Bank was going to be paid for by you and me as taxpayers. And then BB&T turns around and sells the paper so they can collect, sells the mortgage so they can collect their 80% after they squeeze the security out and what's left. And then the debt vulture, set up by the United States government in most cases, comes back and says, that's not enough. We want to keep you down and kick you again. I'll be glad to answer any question you have.
Thank you, Governor. Now, this is the posture.
Okay.
I misspoke, apparently, when I said we had 2 hours. Apparently, Governmental Affairs is going to be here in 10 minutes. Now, so, for fairness, I think what we're going to do is we'll continue these next 15 minutes or 10 minutes that we got. The Governor and the author will come in next week. We'll have an hour until there's a lot of interest in it, and it's a very important subject, as you know. So we'll come back and we'll give those who have concerns of the bill another hour for you to ask them questions too. Okay? We don't know what time that'll be. We'll have a busy week next week. I believe, Representative Flood, I believe you were the last person. If you have a question for the governor.
Well, 1 or 2.
Let's do one.
All right.
Quick one, so everybody can get a...
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see you, Governor.
Good to see you.
Thank you for your support of small businesses and finding opportunities to protect those who reinvest in Georgia. I'd like to perhaps ask a question from a different perspective, because I think the initiative to try to protect small businesses is a noble one. I'm just concerned perhaps about the loopholes that might exist with this bill, so I want to just get some clarification. Now, you mentioned that this bill would only apply to commercial loans.
Well, it applies to any loan where there's a guarantor. I mean, let's face it, on residential loans, Johnny's Homes does not generally buy the house and have a guarantor. So it applies to all loans where there's a guarantor, and 99.9% of them are going to be commercial loans.
And that's good clarification. The guarantor could be, however, someone who's connected to, related to, or in some partnership relationship with the borrower.
Oh, generally are.
Right.
Generally are.
So my concern about the loophole is that you could have a guarantor. We've seen a number of cases where people have gotten themselves in a scenario where they're underwater. The property is worth much less than the value of the loan that remains. That could create a scenario where the borrower, it may be more financially advantageous for the borrower to default.
Well, the loans are in default before they're ever sold. They wouldn't be sold if they're A loans. They're not going to be sold to start with. Banks are hungry for loans, they say, and they don't have enough quality loans, they say. So the loan is in default before it ever is sold.
So the defaulted loan that has a guarantor,
yes,
where you have a guarantor that essentially buys that loan for some significant or reduced value from the original loan price or from the original value of the property?
It's whatever the loan was purchased for. Let's say that plus costs. Now you got it. The due diligence cost, closing cost, appraisal cost, and all that will be added to and divided pro rata. So yes, they could, but what that does is allow them to get out from underwater. In other words, let's say that a fella has 20 lots, and the loan's $1 million. That's $50,000 a lot. There's no way the lots are worth $50,000 now. So what happens? Well, the lots don't get built on because they've got it, and he can't ever get out from under it unless he goes bankrupt. And so then somebody buys the loan, comes in and buys the loan for $300,000, which is $30,000. Is that right? Yeah. Well, $3,000 a lot. He comes in, he gives the fellow that put the $300,000. If he buys it within 30 days, that fellow gets a 10% return just like that. And in 60, if it's more than 30 days, he gets a 20% return. He gets $60,000 return, just like that. After the 90 days, the debt vulture can sue on the $1 million loan and plus full interest. All this does is says when you buy this property, when you buy this debt, which is property, when you buy this debt and you go to sell it, you've got to offer it back to the guarantor so that he can get a lower cost here and hopefully turn loose. The problem we have in Georgia, the reason we have so much, the reason this is a great problem here, Nevada had a similar problem and they passed a similar bill. But the reason that that we have it here is we've had so many bank failures. The policy of the government in saving the big banks and kicking the small banks, and where do small business folks bank? They don't bank at the Bank of New York. They bank with the local bank. And so so many local banks went broke that the government was, when they took over the bank, they told them to get rid of the paper. Or under the cease and desist before. Sometimes they did it under the cease and desist. The guarantee, no, I mean, he could do that, sure. I mean, you know, but why not give him a choice? Why not give the fellow out there trying to put the sweat equity the same shot that the government-sponsored debt vulture had in buying the paper? Why not give him a return? We're just saying, listen, offer it to the little guy before you give it to Goldman Sachs.
Guess what?
What?
We've got more time, actually.
Okay.
We found out the other committee has made other arrangements. So,
Oh, they can meet in the hall.
so we're
I
here,
used to be on that
yeah.
committee.
Governmental affairs, they heard you. I'm sure they've got important work. But, okay. But we are running out of time on the pro side for right now.
I'm here to answer any question you got. If you
Now, I assume some of the other people who signed up want to speak in favor of the bill. Again, we'll come back next week probably, and we can revisit somewhat, maybe when we do 344. Right now, Representative Hardin, I believe, has a question for the governor.
That's called you pulling. I'm sorry.
That's all right. We both know the other guy.
Yeah, I know the other buddy too.
Governor, I appreciate you being here and helping us work through this. I just had one question, and that is, now that the guarantor is going to be able to get that loan back, suppose that will the guarantor then be required to offer that loan to the borrower at a 10% cap?
I don't have any problem with that because the guarantor and the borrower are all, and these small loans, these community loans, they're always the same folks.
Are they? Well, a lot of times, but suppose there's an investor that is guaranteed.
It is just that this bill, as written, only applies to guarantors.
Yeah.
Now, here's this bill in a nutshell. Listen, debt vulture. When you listen, United States government, when you sell this debt, FDIC, to a debt vulture, you got to treat the fella at home at least equally to the fellow on Wall Street. Now, we're going to give you a return for it. But the answer is it does not apply to the borrower. It's the guarantor. But, you know, and I don't want to sound specious, but we're hunting haints and boogers that don't exist. The way these loans exist is they're small folks. They got, as Representative from Augusta said just a moment ago, is Johnny's homes and Johnny's son guaranteed the debt. You're rarely going to ever see where the guarantor and the borrower.
Okay, I guess what I was wondering is if there's an investor here who is guaranteeing commercial loans basically during this housing or commercial real estate boom, then if he got this break back and could make, could get it back to 10%, then if there were some of the borrowers who were not closely connected, that would he go after them for the full amount of the loan, or should they have the same protection that we're giving the?
Care. That's fine with me if you want to give it to them.
Well, that was what I was wondering.
I mean, yeah, that's fine with me.
I
mean, I'm trying to keep this as narrow as possible because I know how it is down here. The law of physics operates perfectly in politics. For every action, there's a corresponding and equal reaction. And I'm trying to draw it as narrowly as what I saw.
Yes.
And I see it mostly in single member borrower and guarantors.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to extend it to a borrower, I don't have any problem with that. I think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to affect many, but I don't have any problem with it.
Thank you, sir.
I think we've got time for one more question for the governor, and I believe, Mr. Caldwell, is that your light down there?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is, if I can remember my question now.
That's the reason. Write them down.
I put this on about 45 minutes ago, and people have asked similar questions, but mine, and in your scenario, Governor, and with Chairman Earhart, I, like you, know that most guarantors are, I use the word related, and I don't mean necessarily kinfolks, but they're business partners, and many times they are relatives.
Yeah.
What would prevent the borrower from going and borrowing $1 million to start a development, and in turn, he then gets guarantors, and so he doesn't make a payment, and in 90 days, he defaults, and it's sold, as you say, and then he bankrupts. Well, you can't go after him anymore. Well, then this guarantor, who's related to him and has a business relation or even a personal kinfolk relation, goes and buys this property, and so they go, sure, they got sold for 10 cents on the dollar, as you say, so they end up then with property that they supposedly got $1 million to buy, and they end up without having to pay it the $1 million back, and they end up with $1 million worth of property, or even if it's decreased to $750,000. So now they only had to pay $300,000 for $750,000 or $1 million. That's what this bill would do, isn't it?
The bank can still foreclose. This doesn't affect. In other words, the bank could.
The bank's out. They've already sold it.
Well, they could have foreclosed before they sold the debt.
I understand, but I'm saying if they've already sold it, as you say, I'm just talking about it's already been sold.
Then that bank probably need to have taken over if they had security that was worth more than 10 cents a dollar.
I'm not talking about the bank. I know what you're saying about the bank. What I'm saying is that then that guarantor, or guarantors if it was more than one, could go in. The borrower's bankrupt, so this vulture folks can't go after him because he's out.
That's right.
Well, then this guarantor could go in and end up with this property. They got $1 million over here to buy. Somebody did, and they bought the property. Well, now they only ended up paying $300,000 for $1 million worth of property. And if I'm wrong, just tell me I'm wrong.
All right, let me answer your question. Number one is that if it was sold to another bank, it doesn't affect.
I said this vulture people like you were talking about.
And if it's a debt vulture, yes, you could happen. But that is, as I said, we're hunting boogers and haints that don't exist.
Well, Governor, I disagree with you.
Well, because here's the thing. So what you're saying is, if you take your position is, all right, the bank that made the loan and that sold it for $300,000 either got TARP money or
no, you said FDIC made them pay it out. You know, made them sell it. That's what I'm saying.
Well, they made them sell it.
I'm taking your worst scenario.
Okay, worst scenario. They made them sell it, but they either got TARP money or they got a loss share that paid 80%. Don't you think that your local fella is entitled to the same shot that of somebody else?
I agree with you.
This is all a balancing of interest. That's what public policy is about. And I will tell you, I'll stand with my local folks that say that a local fella that borrowed the money and generally is suffering and wants to start over again ought to be able to buy the debt at the same price plus a premium that somebody in Wall Street should.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, is that the application, though? Under my scenario,
under extreme circumstances, that could happen.
Right.
But what
that guarantor could buy that property for $300,000, even though it cost $1 million.
Of course,
right.
Yes, he could. I mean, they could do that. However, but the vulture didn't pay $1 million.
I understand.
He didn't pay $1 million, and the folks that got the million, the 700 loss, they've been compensated.
Okay. Well, I just was asking the question.
I understand. It's all a matter of policy. It's whether you stand with the Wall Street or you stand with the local folks.
Chairman Earhart, do you have a last word? A couple of minutes, and then we'll
respond to that just a little bit, because I see where you're going, and statistically that could happen. It probably happened. I saw it happen in the banking industry with several major loans during the time I went through it. They were statistical disparities, I will say that. People did see where they could take advantage of some of the situations the FDIC was setting up. I guess what I'd say is similar to what the governor said. What's different between the debt vulture and your local developer? They're both in a position to take advantage of a situation that was created by the government. And I guess I would again default to the debt, this secondary market purchaser. Even whether it's a debt vulture or whatever we could call it that, they're coming in and taking advantage of a situation, which they're welcome to do. But again, they're using your money and my money to do it. So they're getting the benefit of that. And what this legislation attempts to do is to give that local developer a similar situation, because it's not, none of these monies, as you said, are affecting the banks after this. This is all either money for that out-of-state debt vulture, or you can help prop back up some of your local developers. That's
Okay.
the balance for me.
Thank you.
Both doing wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right, I guess, is my point.
Only in the statistical disparity where that actually happens, and that's going to be very, very few.
My local folks never do wrong.
That's the reason you represent them all the time, Governor.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Governor, thank you. Boys, I'm sure you don't want the governor calling you wives. It's always in any of these divorce courts. Very persuasive. Thank you, Governor. Okay. Mr. Brannon, would you like to come up and say, I know we've got a dwindling committee.
Tell Joe, let Joe tell you how he single-handedly brought down the whole housing industry in the state of Georgia.
No thanks. Mutual help from our former governor. Former, with great pleasure.
I've been insulted by experts. You're a mere amateur.
We were Georgia together. Have been close personal friends for 40-plus years, so we can have a good time. Thank you very much.
I think everybody knows Mr. Brannon, the Georgia Bankers Association, and if you don't know now, we know a little bit more about him, his relationship with the governor, former governor, yeah. Okay, proceed, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I am Joe Brannon, the president of the Georgia Bankers Association. We represent the interest of 249 banks across the state of Georgia. They range in size from the smallest community banks to mid-sized regional banks to some of the largest banks in the country. I appreciate Chairman Earhart. He has been open to talk with us about this issue. We have spent many hours talking about that. He understands where we're coming from, but I'm here today to oppose the legislation as it has been introduced. It is simply bad public policy. As it's written, it will do little more than reward people who have walked away from their debt obligations while stalling a delicate economic recovery. The governor mentioned the bank closure issue. Let me just mention that as well. This last 5 years has been tough on everybody. It's been tough on our communities. It's been tough on the families and businesses our banks are trying to serve, and it's been tough on the banks themselves. Our state was especially hard hit because we are, as the governor said, a real estate-oriented state. At one point, we had as many as 70+% of every loan on every bank's books in the state of Georgia somehow tied to real estate. But you heard the governor talk about the banks that were closed in our state. You read the headlines. Georgia leads the nation in the number of bank closures. By raw numbers, That's correct. We've lost 84 banks. Over 25% of the banks in Georgia have been closed during the downturn. Almost every one was a community bank by anyone's definition. And listen to me on this. Had this bill been in effect when we went into the downturn, our view is we would have lost more. And let me tell you why. Those banks that were closed for principally one reason. Borrowers failed to repay their debts, and by doing so, that depleted the bank's capital. At the height of the financial crisis, more than half of the banks in Georgia were under some sort of regulatory order. Each of those, almost all of those orders had some component in them that required the banks to reduce their level of non-performing loans. As more and more of those commercial borrowers you heard talk about earlier defaulted and increased the level of non-performing loans on the bank's books, for many of those banks, not just the TARP banks that you heard about, not just the loss share banks, but these are just regular banks, the only way they could reduce their non-performing assets was to sell those notes. There were a few healthy banks in position or to buy those notes, or they were already overly concentrated in real estate. So the only place those loans could be sold were to the note buyers. We are confident, had those note buyers not been operating here in Georgia, we would have seen more banks closed by our regulators. When I continue to hear that this bill doesn't affect the banks, any of you that sell something, any of you that are in a business that you sell something, when the government tells you that your price can be no more than this that you're selling it for, it affects you. This bill only applies to notes that are sold by banks to third parties. It directly affects the banks in Georgia. If this bill passes, we believe the note buyers will just simply go somewhere else. I don't know of a state in the union that has a policy like you're considering here, and losing that pool of note buyers would be a devastating blow to those institutions that need to take advantage of that. You'll hear from note buyers, so I won't go into much detail about that, but it may help you to understand a little bit about the note sale process. Let me be clear here. Most notes aren't sold. Most notes that the banks have stay on the bank's books. Loans that are the predominant asset of any financial institution, and as long as they're performing loans, most of them stay on the books. What's being sold is what you heard. The notes that are being sold are those that are not performing. The borrowers are not living up to their obligation for any number of reasons, but that's why they're being sold. But once a financial institution decides what notes that are most likely to be bought, they give the note buyers the opportunity to begin the due diligence process. And you heard some conversation about that. That due diligence is an expensive process. They hire teams of experts to help them value those notes. Some notes are sold individually. More recently, we've seen pools of notes. So one of our institutions, you might have read in the newspaper a few weeks ago, sold almost $500 million pool of notes. So they employ lawyers, accountants, appraisers, other people to help them value those assets so they know what to bid on them. It was interesting to hear the comment about note buyers earn enough by getting a 10% return or premium in 30 days or a 20% premium or return in 90 days. I think 2 points get missed there. One is just the cost to perform due diligence. I know you're considering a substitute that might address that, but there's no guarantee that a note buyer would get the money they put into due diligence back. But the second thing, and this is just a philosophical divide that I think we have here, and that's the role of the free market in this state. A willing buyer and a willing seller is the best way to determine the ultimate value of any asset, not an arbitrary limit set by the government. And that's what you're being asked to do. To this latter point, we believe that the value of notes sold will be effectively set by statute at 60% of the original indebtedness. that value is simply not realistic based on real estate valuations today and in the foreseeable future. For example, depending on the underlying assets, notes are sold at a range of discounts. Hard to dispose of assets, you heard mention of lots. If those lots are in far removed locations from metropolitan areas, those notes could be sold for pennies on the dollar. But for the reasons I've mentioned related to how notes are sold, the due diligence process, if any of the note buyer in our state, if you pass this, and I use if in the biggest sense of the word, the only thing we will ever be able to sell is a note that has a value greater than 60% of the original indebtedness. What's that going to do? What is that going to do? That's going to leave the bank saddled with the less valuable notes, no way to dispose of those notes, no way to monetize those notes, bring that money into capital, and to facilitate lending. This committee and the committees before y'all have spent hundreds of hours. We were laughing about that as the governor left. Y'all have spent hundreds of hours making sure we've got the kinds of laws on the books in the state of Georgia that facilitate lending. You give people the opportunity to borrow money from your locally chartered institutions here in our state. That's what you do. That is what you do as a legislator. We believe this flies in the face of that general principle of being able to provide that kind of environment for our banks to remain healthy and continue our process towards stabilization. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me have the time to be with you, and for all those reasons, we urge you to oppose this legislation. Thank you. Glad to.
Answer the question. Representative Kelly,
Yes,
I believe, had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. I just want to kind of get back to the scenario that the judge brought up there. What impact could it have on our local small town banks should, even a small amount that was alluded to in prior testimony of our borrower guarantor teams just decided not to make another payment in the hopes that they would just buy it off once it came at just a 10%?
Sure. I mean, that was a great question that you asked, because that's exactly the scenario. In most of these loans that we're talking about, the person that borrowed the money is the one and the same as the guarantor. So you're talking about one person in effect, and you're talking about buying a $300 million loan with the $300,000. The bank took that loss of the $700,000 when it went in there. So to not be able to sell that note is what we're saying is the difficulty here. So we've taken the loss, we've sold it off, we've tried to recover something for. We're much better at making loans than we are chasing borrowers that have walked away from their debt. And I think that's what we're trying to get back, make sure we can continue to have, is the banks in the lending business, and those notes that the borrowers have walked away from. Apparently they've got some money. Apparently they've got some money to repay their debt. They're just not doing it. This creates that level playing field to go after those borrowers that can't do it, because apparently they are out there.
It's me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's been a long time since I had my question, too. I've never been lectured quite like that in a committee meeting before. I wanted to go all the way back, not from where we are with the distressed loan, but I'm the loan officer, and I've made these loans before, and I'm sitting there.
You
and
didn't get the bonus.
And I've got Johnny's Homes sitting there. And Johnny's Homes is Johnny.
Right.
And I can't separate the guarantor from the borrower.
Right.
And it seems to me if this should pass, I, as the loan officer, if Johnny's Homes ever comes to me in the future, Johnny's not going to be able to borrow unless he's got 100% equity, because I'm looking to Johnny. And if I can't guarantee it somehow, most of those loans to those small businesses would not be made without the 100% guarantor's guarantee. And in most instances, it is that same person. That's right. Would this not put a great chill on future lending if we could not be assured that this person that says, I will repay this note, it doesn't say unless the real estate market goes down or unless the vultures come by, would not that put a real chilling effect on future lending?
Yes, sir, it would. And you're making exactly the right right points there. Most of these projects are not people. There are LLCs, there are entities that are created, and we're not lending money to an entity. We're lending money to a person that we know has some capacity. These are people we've dealt with for years. It's in our best interest to keep them in business. We want them to pay that loan. We need the loan payments a lot more than we need a bunch of real estate.
Yeah.
So yes, that would certainly chill that.
And it seems to me, I know the idea, there's been a lot of good people caught up in a lot of bad stuff.
Yes, sir.
But it seems to me it's kind of, you're to help a few people, you could possibly put a great chill across the whole industry for the state of Georgia, what this would seem to me.
That's our view as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Duncan, do you have a question for this gentleman?
Thank you, Mr. Brannon. I am a builder, and so I've lived this, I guess, somewhat of Johnny's life for the last 5 years. And so I think the question I've got is, what is the trajectory? As a builder and as developers in the industry, what do you see the regulatory trajectory going forward? And is this a fix that just fixes today, or does it help us? Because I think from a builder's perspective, we have to be years out in front of ourselves
Sure.
with our investments.
Sure. And we do too. We've got a regulatory policy that I haven't even mentioned. The governor mentioned that, and he was right in a lot of the things that he said. We do have a regulatory policy that is hampering our ability to grow Georgia in the real estate area. For example, I mentioned those regulatory orders that the banks were under. There's this arbitrary limit on what a bank can lend in real estate. It's 300% of their capital if it's a certain type of loan, or 100% if it's another. We had banks in Georgia that far exceeded that, and they did well by that. But now we can't do that, so we've shrunk back. Most of the banks are under those arbitrary limits right now. We see those remaining in place for some time to come. But we've got to figure it out too, and we've got to figure out how to work with borrowers that we've worked with in the past. They don't look as pretty as they used to. They've got dings, they've got scars, but those are the people that we know. We know they can build. We just know that they're in a position today that they need to somehow be able to borrow in the future, and that's where we are. Valuation. We're at a valuation period that none of us has ever seen. Those valuations, frankly, are helping us to build more than we would in the past. We're seeing signs of building all over metropolitan Atlanta, especially along the coast and even in the mountains, that I didn't think we would see for another 10 years, because the valuations are what they are. We can afford to make some loans that we might not have been able to make otherwise. So we're seeing some signs of stability. We're seeing some signs of birth and of new birth in the building trades, and a state like Georgia, fast-growing state, we still need to have that, and that's where our principal source of revenue is going to come from in the future.
Mr. Weldon, is that you down there?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here, Mr. Brannon. The concern I have with this legislation is that if this not only applies to what's been referred to as the debt vultures, this applies to local folks. This is going to be a statewide law. It's going to apply to local folks that may want to buy the debt from a bank at a lower cost. Then they'd have the issue of the guarantors coming in and dealing with that. And I think you hit squarely on the head, the nail squarely on the head when you said, what kind of market are we going to have when a bank encounters this type of situation? Who's going to buy it? And it affects everybody, every bank in the state, not only big banks but little banks throughout the state. And that's what I was hoping to pose. The question was, how is that going to affect the market for foreclosed properties and properties that are distressed, in a distressed situation? Because the concern I have is if we don't have those people or entities out there competing to purchase that security for the debt that's gone bad, that just causes even a further drop in the value that banks will be able to recover for the security that they're holding. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think what you're talking about is just the basic issue of real estate valuations, the impact of foreclosures on that, and clearing that system. This isn't going to do a thing to help that, for sure. I mean, we are seeing, and I don't know if the realtors are going to talk, but we have seen some really good numbers in the past 6 months. Every month seems to be better than the previous. That fewer foreclosures properties are being sold, and more traditional properties are coming on the market. So we're seeing a real clearing of the foreclosures. I mean, we were hit hard with that. I mean, the numbers of sheer foreclosures has been devastating in our state, which has devastated real estate values. We're working through that system now, and that's a positive thing.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, pose one more further comment. Traditionally, the way that the washing out that the governor referred to of the debt so that people could get back on their feet and move forward was that same process we just described. When things go through that, when properties are foreclosed upon, the bank's holding the property, then they go out, they ask the people who agreed to guarantee the loan to come forward with the money. They don't, then they allow it. I think part of the issue can be handled separate from this bill is requiring them to foreclose on the property first and go after that, not just go after a judgment on the note. And I think that's probably what's happening is banks are selling they're just selling the paper, the note. These other folks are buying it, and then they're pursuing the note, getting a judgment, and then they don't have to go through the foreclosure process until later on. But they still, the folks who have purchased those properties still have the debt.
Well, we're out of the picture. If we've sold the note, we're not doing anything. It's in the hands of the buyer. So we're not part of. If I'm understanding the scenario you said, we're not pursuing anybody. We have sold the note. It's in someone else's ownership. You made one other point that I have forgotten what you said that I wanted to make sure. The whole what I want to remember to say is, again, the notes that we are selling, these are not the good notes. These are not the performing loans. These are loans that the borrower is unable to pay for whatever reason. These are not performing loans that are being sold. These are loans that the borrower isn't paying. This is the same borrower, as we've heard described, that somehow has found money that wasn't willing to pay us, but is willing to buy down at a substantial discount his own debt. So that it's just sort of I'm never be nice about it, but it's almost a perverse reward for not living up to your obligations.
Thank you.
One more from Mr. Brannon. Representative Teasley, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask the question that Mr. Brannon. I had certainly punched the button a long time ago. I just basically want to echo what Representative Flood and Representative Caldwell have said, and I think you just basically hit it right in your last remarks. The concern about allowing a guarantor to be able to buy back, even at a higher rate, is we are perhaps incentivizing bad behavior by the borrower. That if they are in a relationship with a guarantor, as the governor even said, is most often the case, that we are potentially going to incentivize them to default on their loan in the hopes that their business partner can buy it at a reduced rate. Do I understand this? That's certainly been my understanding as I read this.
Sure. Back in the early part of the financial crisis, I don't know what else to call it, we saw disappointing behavior with a number of people that we had loaned money to for an awful long time. When the banks were finding their capital was being depleted by the increasing numbers of defaulted loans, we saw borrowers just stop paying in the hopes that the bank would close. And in the early closures, in the first year of the closures, we didn't have loss share. We didn't have what the FDIC came up with. We've got example after example. When the FDIC just took all the assets and they were putting on auction sites, we have example after example of some of those same borrowers through third parties were able to buy their own assets at we've got one example of 2 cents on the dollar. That's not a functioning market, and I'm not saying that's what this would do, but it looks a lot like that.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bridges, did you have a comment you wanted to make? Steve Bridges, of Community Bankers Association.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify today on this legislation. I am Steve Bridges, and I do represent the Community Bankers Association, and we represent over 200 community banks across the state. I come before you really to express some very serious concerns with this legislation, and a lot of the points have already been made that I intended to make. I'll try to make those briefly in terms of those that have already been made. One thing I want to tell you that we've heard a lot about the in the governor's testimony, you heard a lot about how FDIC and the federal government handled the situation we've been going through for the last 4 or 5 years. I can tell you straight up that the folks I represent, they'd be the first to agree that they disagree with how it's been handled. Okay? But to me, that's immaterial to what we're talking about today, because we are where we are. And so you're talking about going forward, moving forward, dealing with where we are, because that was above my pay grade in terms of who made those decisions about how that was going to be handled. I don't agree with it all at all, and I agree with much of what the governor said in that regard. But to me, as it relates to this bill, that's immaterial. I want to make basically 3 points, and they've all been touched on in one way or the other. But if this bill passes, Georgia will become a place that's very unattractive for debt buyers to purchase distressed loans. Clearly that point's been made. I wish our state did not, and I wish our banks in this state did not need debt buyers. But the fact of the matter is that we have quite a lot of bad loans still on the books, even today, with all the bank failures that have occurred. And we do need debt buyers. And if you're talking about the big nationwide, as was referred to, out-of-state debt vultures, quite honestly, the way we are, the way we sit today, we need them. They do not need us. They will go to another state. They will buy debt. There's bad debts in plenty of states. So they'll go somewhere else and buy the debt. We actually need them here. One of the reasons we need them here is to help us to complete that washing out process that the governor referred to. Because my guys, we had a board meeting yesterday of my membership, and one of the things, this bill was one of the things they talked about and discussed, and one of the things that they said was that this is going to slow down the economic recovery, because it's going to slow down the washing out of the problem. And, you know, I wish to goodness we didn't need debt buyers to help us wash out the problem, but we do. And that's a fact, I think. The second point, as I said, I wanted to make is I think it's going to slow down the economic recovery. And then if you make this no longer economically viable for people to purchase these loans in Georgia, obviously they'll go somewhere else and they won't purchase them. Now, the other impact that I think this is going to have, and this has already been talked about by Representative Caldwell, I think Kelly, Nix, and others, but this ability to game the system, because that's exactly what I see that we were talking about when Representative Caldwell first made his points earlier. I think you present and incentivize, as I think the representative over here says, defaults on loans. And to me, I don't see how that is good public policy, to incentivize defaults on loans in those kind of situations. And I think there's no way around that. That was one of the first things that some of my guys said after they read this yesterday. is why wouldn't I default on the loan? Why wouldn't I stop paying? Because I can buy it back the next day for a 10% premium, because they know that many of our banks are under pressure to reduce classified loans. The only way we can reduce those classified loans in a lot of cases is to sell those loans to a third party. It's correct that the way this bill reads, if I sold it to another bank, it wouldn't affect them. But none of our banks in this state, I've verified, and I think Joe mentioned this, was this way, but I verified with the banking department this morning. We still have over 50% of our banks in this state that are under some form of administrative action. Most of those administrative actions are cease and desist orders. Most of those cease and desist orders have requirements in them to reduce classified assets by some kind of time schedule. So they know, the borrowers know, that the banks are under pressure to sell these loans. So if they default, they know it may be likely that it gets sold. And who wouldn't take a chance on that in order to reduce the amount of the debt that they owe? So I think those points are very well taken. I would very strongly urge you to oppose the passage of this bill. And I'll be glad to answer questions if there are any. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Houston, do you have?
I tried to turn it off. He answered my question.
I got it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bridges.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else that wants to speak in opposition to the bill? Okay, well, you raised your hand first. She beat you to the draw. Go ahead, identify yourself, tell us who you're with, and
my name is Harriet Eisenberg, and I'm an attorney, and I practice in the area of creditors' rights. And although I'm not here as chairperson of the creditors' rights section of the bar, I have a lot of constituents, if you will, that we have a forum that we, share information and talk about legislation. So a few people have asked me to come and make sure that that you all know what our position is as creditors' rights attorneys. We have some here and some were not able to come. But at any rate, my experience has been, I represent banks, suppliers, landlords, subcontractors, and builders have during this, well, really for a long time, even before 2008, they would get the money from the bank and they would live lavish lifestyles. They wouldn't pay the suppliers. They gave me work. I appreciate that part. But they got all that money, and now they don't want to pay it back. Maybe they should sell their airplanes. I don't know. Some have, that's happened. But anyway, and some have just, come on bad times and things didn't sell, and some of it's bank's faults and lots of faults. But anyway, I just want to make a few points. I'm just giving you some of my perspective, I guess, of what, but maybe that makes me somewhat passionate about this. One thing that's a minor thing is a practical problem in that you've heard that these loans are sold in pools, and it's going to be very hard for anybody to pick out a particular price for a particular debt, because if you buy $1 million worth of loans for $80,000, and I don't know what the numbers would be. How do you tell how much any particular loan was? Because they're bought based on collectability and age, and there's a risk that these debt buyers take, and I think that should be something to consider, that they don't. 10% is not going to encourage them to buy any debt, and I do agree that it's going to encourage defaults if you let this people. Why should they pay 100% when they can pay 70%? But I'll tell you what bothers me the most, and as a lawyer, and I'm not really don't consider myself a constitutionalist. I don't really practice that area of the law, but I do know that Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution prohibits the states from making any laws that impair the obligation of contracts. A guarantee is a contract. The contract says, I agree to pay X amount of dollars at X amount of interest, and I agree that this loan can be assigned at any time. So why would I not have to keep my promise? And I think that some of you all have picked up on that exact point. I promised to pay something, and I'm going to pay it, and I should pay it. Now, if I can't pay it, there are remedies. I can file bankruptcy, that would probably be the best remedy, I guess. I can move to another country, as some of them have done. So that's, I think the very heart of what we do is we agree to things. We make promises, and we have to keep our promises. This would also affect business credit cards. If you own a business and you want to have a business credit card, you've got to guarantee it. So nobody's going to, and credit card debt is sold, a lot. And I can't tell you the numbers, but somebody here probably can tell you the numbers. At any rate, they're sold a lot of times to debt buyers. Well, nobody is going to give corporate credit cards out anymore, because if they try to sell them, they're going to lose money on them. So nobody's going to buy them. Put it that way. Not in this state. Another thing that's not really covered in this, but it's implied, is judgments are sometimes sold. And now you have a court that has passed on a judgment that said this is how much the judgment's going to be. And then you sell that judgment. Some people buy judgments. And then somebody else is going to come out. There's a law that's going to say, oh, that judgment that judge ordered, nah, we're not going to honor that judgment. We're going to just only make you pay 70% of that judgment. So that's not really, I don't think that's one of those unintended consequences, I think. Equipment leases is another thing. When you go and buy a copy machine or lease a copy machine, those finance agreements are sold immediately. And they're usually guaranteed. It's your telephone systems, your copiers, your various equipment. Well, who's going to want to let anybody lease equipment if they're only going to end up, if they have to, when they sell that debt, they're only going to get 70%. Nobody's going to do it for that. And the only other thing I'd like to say, this is called the Small Business Borrower Protection Act, and it is exactly the opposite. It's going to make it impossible for businesses to borrow money, because the banks just can't have their hands tied when they get ready to sell the instruments as they need to correct their balance sheets. So if the small business can't get a credit card or lease equipment, how would this legislation help small businesses?
Thank you, Ms. Eisenberg.
Thank you. I don't guess any questions.
No. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Richard Monroe. I am the current president of DBA International, which is the Debt Buyers Association. It's a national non-for-profit association that has 625 member companies, of which there are 23 Georgia members that comprise of, some of them are large public companies, some of them are mid-size, and a lot of them, some of them that are here today, are small businesses that are owned typically by collection attorneys that are experts in analyzing and collecting debt. So I wanted to point out, the governor spoke earlier about the debt vultures that are created by the government here. There's a much larger secondary market that have very sophisticated players in it that definitely play a root cause of keeping the credit flowing in the state of Georgia. And they made many comments earlier about this is very specific to a commercial real estate loan. A few of the other speakers just mentioned that this has broader consequences across not only the other types of debt that Harriet just mentioned, but you've got auto loans, you've got installment loans, and there's a much bigger impact here that this legislation would have on that. So want to make sure that we make ourselves available to talk about the current language of the legislation. We feel very strongly that looking at a very specific situation when there's billions of dollars of debt that gets bought and sold in the state of Georgia on an annual basis, whether it is individual state buyers that buy specifically just state of Georgia or national buyers that buy as a part of a large portfolio, The other thing too, these deals happen in many cases with tens of thousands of loans. And when the way the legislation currently reads, you have to go in and specifically notify guarantors on those loans, which many of them will have guarantors. So it becomes a very laborious situation to do that when you're talking about a large portfolio. I won't really dispute that there may be some issues with specifically the FDIC transaction as it's been described, and we're wide open to talk about possible solutions there, but we just want to make sure that we're not having a much larger impact on all the other debt that gets bought and sold in the state of Georgia.
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Monroe? Let's see. You're ready.
This was alluded to with the lady that preceded you that, well, would these people know how to value their debt? To, I think was the term that she used, if your company bought it, and if you bought it in a pool, well, if you don't know how to value it, why'd you buy it?
Well, no, but I'm not suggesting they don't know how to buy it. There is a due diligence process that takes place.
Then they could use that same due diligence process to know what to sell it back out at, couldn't it? It'd be the same thing, wouldn't it?
In terms, based on the fact that you have to notify the guarantor, and the guarantor has the ability to buy it.
Well, she said it'd be hard to know how to value it because you buy them in pools, and you wouldn't know how to go. It'd take too much problem to go to each one and try to.
That's absolutely right. That's right. Because a lot of times it's thousands of accounts.
Well, that may be true. If you didn't want to do it, why'd you buy it to start with?
Well, you can do an evaluation on the borrower and the makeup of the borrower.
That's right.
On the pool of accounts.
Question. And she also said, and I was going to ask this, that if you had a judgment, you just wouldn't have to pay it. Are y'all trying to tell me that if there's a judgment, I'm not saying you hadn't already forfeited, but if there's a judgment, that this people that the governor was talking about could just walk away from a judgment?
Is the way the law is written, I think that's what it alludes to, yes.
Well, you practice law.
I'm not an attorney, sir.
Okay. Well, I sat on the bench 15 years, and if somebody didn't have my judgment, they'd be in jail the next day.
Don't disagree with that. Don't disagree with that at all.
Thank you, Judge. Does anybody else have any questions? Mr. Monroe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate you coming. Thank you. Is there anybody else that's opposed? Yes, sir.
Members of the committee, thank you each for your time. I appreciate it. My name is Pat Poe. I'm a lawyer here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'll try to be brief. I think if I read through my notes, I should be approximately 3.5 to 4 minutes, and hopefully I won't be overly redundant, and I'll have a few new bits of information to provide. I'm here because this bill is bad for business. It's bad for my business, and it's bad law. This is another investor bailout bill like 448 was last year, and it was rejected last year, and this bill should be rejected for many of the same reasons, because this is simply a tailored down and somewhat watered down version of the bill that was rejected last year. I think we've recognized through some of the points made here that the math is actually pretty easy. What would happen is if the loan borrowed by Johnny Homebuilder was $1,000 and then Johnny Homebuilder decided, or for whatever reason defaulted on that loan, then the bank sold that loan to a debt buyer for $100, then Johnny could come along and purchase that loan for $110. The math is pretty straightforward, and I think it creates what may be the perverse incentives that we've been talking about. This is bad for my business. My small law firm employs just under 50 people. Almost all of our clients are creditors. Essentially, all of my clients will be negatively impacted by this legislation. Countless other small businesses and significantly larger businesses in Georgia will be impacted by this legislation, including banks, lenders, car dealers, law firms, retail establishments, etc. What is bad for my clients is bad for my business and the business of numerous other law firms and businesses that service or benefit from the credit industry in Georgia. HB 82
retroactively unwinds contractual obligations between a lender and a guarantor, and it impairs contract rights in Georgia. It's that simple. The bill devalues loan guarantees in Georgia and impedes the credit market from freely transferring negotiable instruments, which is in conflict with the Uniform Commercial Code as adopted by Georgia in 1967. Contracts are the bedrock of business. Undermining contracts in Georgia is a slippery slope. Also, if developers are relieved of risk, are they more likely to do riskier projects? I think this idea has been explored. Further, obviously, I'm not the only one that's recognized that it creates the perverse incentives of defaulting on loans. So, of an LLC, a single person, and a single member LLC defaulting on a loan, so the person that guaranteed the loan could buy that loan at a steep discount. It's important to recognize that this is very different than the tax sales that were talked about. In the tax sale context, it's my understanding that the debtor, the person that owns the tax or the purchaser of the tax, has to buy the tax at full value, and then there's a cap on the interest that can be charged, and I believe that's 10%. In this case, we're talking about, again, a $1,000 loan that might be bought for $100, and then that the guarantor gets a windfall for being able to buy it at a significantly discounted price. Businesses rely on the stability and enforceability of contracts. Businesses in Georgia and businesses considering business in Georgia will be discouraged by legislation undermining and devaluing contracts. The bill impairs contracts, and the bill does not protect small businesses. In fact, it impairs the contracts that enable business between sophisticated investors. Typically, these investors understand the contracts and fully understand the risks that they take on when they sign those personal guarantees. This is simply an out when the deal doesn't go as they hoped. The sale of negotiable instruments, a contract, should not relieve a party of his or her contractual obligation and should not result in a windfall to the defaulting party. Debt buyers take risks of investment in the hope to make a profit. This bill caps profits for certain entities at 10% and doesn't really take into account costs. I understand there may be some revisions contemplated that may affect that, but at the end of the day, as was mentioned before, this bill invades the business process of those entities that would buy debt, and it presumes to know what value or what profit is appropriate for the business when the free market is the appropriate decider of what the value of those debts are. I think Chairman Earhart was correct when he said people need to pay what they owe. What this bill does is add the caveat, unless the loan is sold. Another thing I'd like to mention is that there's already a mechanism in place that addresses the circumstance when people can't pay their debts or make good on their obligations, and it is bankruptcy. While people don't want to have to file bankruptcy, that is what you do when you can't make good on your obligations. This bill instead says if you've got the cash to pay a discounted price in the next 30 or 90 days, then you'll get the windfall that results from the default that your LLC created. So I think that covers all the points I wanted to make. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. And thank you, Mr. Monroe, Mr. Bridges, Mr. Brannon, speaking in opposition. If there were others who had signed up to speak in favor of the bill, the way it operates is I give the latitude to the author of the bill to use his time, and he preferred to take the hour with himself, his attorney, and Governor Barnes. If we take up the bill again, we'll have the list. You'll be at the top of the list if you want to speak in favor of the bill at that time. And if there's no further business, again, as a reminder to the committee, thank you all. Committee, it's been a long, but I wouldn't call it boring. Thank you, Mr. Brannon, for that. Yeah, I wouldn't call it boring. It was interesting and a deadly serious subject. So thank you for staying with me, committee. We will have a hearing again on House Bill 344. The subcommittee assigned will hear at its pleasure House Resolution 75. The meeting is adjourned.